Today is Palm Sunday. It is the day that we remember the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem as the inauguration of Holy Week that Christians have been celebrating for almost 2,000 years. We, of course, now have the benefit of knowing today how the story ends. But on this Sunday in Jerusalem, on the lead up to Passover, perhaps around the year 30 CE, no one knew how the week was going to unfold. What people did know was that for much of the region, and in Jerusalem in particular, there existed a palpable sense of anxiety amongst the Jewish people who were living under the oppression and domination of the Roman Empire. Context matters here. Context is always important as we seek deeper understanding of the gospel narrative and the dynamics swirling about the text. The often understood and overly simplified version of the story is that Jesus, the conquering hero, enters the city to the celebration of waving palm branches and a joyous people embracing the Messiah. Perhaps, like many of you, I once misunderstood this story merely as being a welcoming celebration of Jesus before I had the foreknowledge of what was to come. Jesus, the Messiah, was going to save the world in just a few short days. So, of course, this was a moment of triumph and celebration. But in reality, the palm wavers that day did not actually know how the rest of the week was going to take place. And this Palm Sunday entry of Jesus was not really a traditional triumphant entry. Instead, it was more of a theatrical mockery of the kind of power these kinds of processions typically represented. During these years of Roman occupation in Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate was the Roman governor and prefect of the region. The political system in which Jewish people lived under was a system of power and domination. They were oppressed and controlled by the demands of Rome. Their wealth was taxed and collected to empower the empire, and even their religious institutions of the temple were tightly controlled with close relationships between Rome and the Jewish leaders. Rome held influence over what we might understand today as both the church and the state, which were uniquely intertwined. The oppressed people of Jerusalem would have been eager for liberation and freedom from their Roman occupiers. On top of that everyday reality, these were the days leading up to Passover, the high holy days celebrating their liberation from a previous oppressor in Egypt. It was not uncommon in the first century for the festive days of Passover to occasionally break out into protests or riots that needed to be put down by those in power. This meant that for Roman officials, Passover in Jerusalem would feel like a tinderbox of resentment and desire for liberation. So it's perhaps no surprise to imagine that the procession of Jesus on Palm Sunday was not actually the only procession taking place at that time. Around that same time that Jesus would have been entering the city from the east, there would have been another, different procession happening through the western gate of the city. A common event that is essential for understanding the context of Palm Sunday's arrival of Jesus. Pontius Pilate arrived from the west, coming from his seaside compound of Caesarea on the coast. In a prominent show of force, he would have paraded into the city this time of year in order to demonstrate law and order and quell potential rumblings of political dissent. Arriving with a contingency of armed soldiers, marching alongside with chariots and other tools of violence and war, and Pilate seated high on a war horse, commanding and declaring his strength and authority. Make no mistake, this was not merely a practical or logistical movement of resources. It was a demonstration of military might, a show of force, a theatrical presentation of power likened to the military parades of dictators that still occur around the world to this day. This is a tactic of worldly power and might that seeks to keep the people in their place. It acted as a warning for those who may want to protest or seek reform. Rome upheld this belief that the best power comes through force, armed with weapons and riding high on top of a war horse. So then, now we turn to the Eastern Gate, where an entirely different kind of procession is taking place, a procession whose power is only fully appreciated when contrasted with that triumphant entry of Pilate on the other side of the city. We turn now to Mark 11. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter, if you will find there a colt that has never been ridden, untie it and bring it. If anyone says to you, 'Why are you doing this?' just say this, 'The Lord needs it, and it will be back here immediately.'" They went away and found a colt tied near a door outside in the street. As they were untying it, some of the bystanders said to them, "What are you doing untying that colt?" They told them that what Jesus had said, and they allowed them to take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. Many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest!" Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, it was already late. He went out to Bethany with the 12. We see here in this scripture that much of the text is focused on a seemingly trivial assignment of arranging transportation for Jesus. But as most of us recognize, this task of identifying a colt or young donkey for Jesus has some really important implications. In another gospel account, Matthew spells it out explicitly. As is often the case for the Gospel of Matthew, great effort is given to connecting Jesus to the accounts in the Hebrew Scriptures. In this case, a direct reference is given to Zechariah 9. "Rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Matthew even goes so far as to flat out say in verse 8 that this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Just as when Pilate rides into Jerusalem with an intentional show of force, and a demonstration of power, so too is this procession by Jesus, a carefully orchestrated show of theatrics. When Jesus arrives on a donkey, it is not merely happenstance that folks look back on as if Jesus serendipitously fulfills his prophecy through divine intervention. It is an intentional choice. It's street theater. It makes a mockery of the powerful procession of those with worldly power and might. Jesus would have known this passage from Zechariah. He knew what he was doing and was embracing that role, including these next verses that Matthew does not include. In Zechariah 9, it says, or in 10, it says, "I will take away the chariots from Ephraim, and the war horses from Jerusalem, and the battle bow will be broken. We will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth." This is the Prince of Peace and the Messiah coming into Jerusalem to a people desperate to be saved and liberated. When they shout Hosanna, they are saying, "Pray, save us." But it is likely that many folks waving palm branches that day may have been confused by the way that Jesus entered the city and the kind of Messiah that he actually was. The palm branch itself can be a victory, a sign of victory and triumph, but for those in Jerusalem, palms were also a national sign of revolution and liberation, as they were the symbol of the Maccabean revolt over a century before. Many folks were hoping for their Messiah to come in from the east the same way that Pilate rode in from the west. And I believe that if we are honest with ourselves, this remains the prevailing desire for so many people today. Whether it is social, political, or religious movements, there often continues to be a desire for victory to come through domination, power, and force. To win at any cost, that might makes right, and our enemies need to suffer and be crushed under the force of our righteous power. But that was never the way of Jesus. It was not then, and it is not now. Time and time again, we have the choice to make about which kind of demonstration, which kind of procession we will choose to line up for. One that centers its authority in power and domination, or one that seeks to dismantle the tools of war used for violence and oppression. This is the Messiah of Zechariah, the Messiah that Jesus reveals in his mock procession into the city of Jerusalem. And it is in this very same region today we are currently witnessing one of the greatest catastrophes of occupation and domination in recent history. Just as the economic and security concerns were real and complicated in the first century, so too today are there very real and confusing challenges of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Gaza and the West Bank. Despite there being individuals and organizations speaking peace into the conflict, it is very apparent that the tools and strategy embraced by those on all sides in power making the decisions in this conflict are more closely aligned with the might of Roman authority than the ways of peace that Jesus exemplified in his ministry. Our nation and current president's administration are complicit in financing and supporting these tools of violence and weapons of war, with billions of dollars going to this region, as well as billions more to other parts of the world. Despite generous foreign aid and help that America sends around the world, it has also participated in and benefited from systems of domination and power throughout the 20th century. Many Americans and even Christians often find themselves cheering on the empire, especially when one's chosen leader has ascended into power. But Jesus did not come to embrace that kind of power. He was born in a lowly manger, often minimized attention to his own ministry, and rides into town on one of the most unassuming of animals. He did not come to incite a riot of vengeance, but an uproar of love. And there were plenty of folks who were desperate for the former, who wanted a fight and understandably wanted justice, but the justice of God does not come arrogantly riding on the back of a war horse, as desperately as we may sometimes want it to. And that knowledge is especially difficult to embrace when there is a foot on the back of the neck. So too is it important to name that it's remarkably privileged position to be critical of any beliefs about conflict that does not have an immediate impact on our own day-to-day lives. But over and over again, we see the ministry and character of Jesus turning the expectations of this world on its head. Parables that are confusing, the commands of the Beatitudes that are challenging, the disarming of his own disciples who seek to defend him, and the continuing call to love our enemies, pray for them. While it's true that Jesus exhibited frustration and anger turning over tables in the temple, he never physically harmed anyone or called others to do so, despite likely having some popular support to do it. Jesus did not incite a violent mob or summon them with the purpose of getting them fired up with anger and rage towards the Romans for a violent insurrection. In fact, verse 11 says, "Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he looked around at everything, it was already late, and he went out to Bethany with the 12. He did not light a match and watch it burn. He did not encourage or incite violence on Palm Sunday, even when there were many, many folks who would have eagerly followed his lead. The lordship of Jesus was different. It favored humility over pride, patience over arrogance, peace over war, harmony over victory, and love over hate. On Thursday night, Jesus ate his final meal with his disciples and called them towards another way of living. He surprised them with a practice of remembrance, using bread and wine, and he thoroughly confused them when he knelt to wash their feet. Jesus was a countercultural radical who continues to invite us to the table and participate in his way of being. We have the opportunity each and every day of our lives. We also have a very practical and unique opportunity to experience this rich ritual with one another as we participate in Love Feast together this coming Thursday. Maybe you have never missed a Love Feast, or perhaps you have never once attended one before. I encourage and challenge all of us to consider what it might mean in our own lives and in the chaotic world around us to gather together for a simple meal in a dimly lit basement of a church and participate in the sacred acts that Jesus called us to at his last gathered meal. For those of you with children, childcare would be provided. For those of you just not interested in attending, you might be surprised at how meaningful this time together can be. For those of you watching us remotely, it may not be the same as being in person, but you can join us via Zoom. While it may be true that the world has changed, developed, and advanced over the last 2,000 years, we do still need the way of Jesus every bit as much today as in the first century. Today is Palm Sunday. It really is. Today is that day, just like it was then. We are about to enter into a holy week where we have the advantage of knowing how the story ends. In the end of this story, love wins. So as we struggle through the chaos, division, domination, and oppression that definitely still exists in the world all around us today, may we not seek to put all of our hope in the theatrics that come in riding mightily upon and among the tools of war and violence and power. But may we instead turn our eyes upon Jesus, who humorously and mockingly rides upon a donkey, dismantling our own expectations and desires for what power looks like, towards deeper understanding about the ultimate power of humility and love that Jesus reveals.